There was a time when NBA players weren't millionaires. They weren't flying private, buying luxury cars, or signing sneaker deals worth more than a small country's economy. Nope. In the early days, NBA stars barely made enough to survive. Believe it or not, some of them had side jobs in the offseason just to pay rent. Back in the early days, NBA players made about 2.5 times the average family's income. Fast forward to today, and we've got players signing $300 million contracts like it's nothing. Superstars are making more in one season than entire NBA teams used to make in a decade. So, what happened? How did we go from players struggling to make ends meet to today's billion-dollar empire where benchwarmers make more than legends from the past?
$161 million, over $300 million.
This is the wild history of NBA contracts. Before the NBA became the multi-billion-dollar empire it is today, professional basketball was basically a hustle. When the league was officially founded in 1946 as the Basketball Association of America, before emerging with the National Basketball League in 1949 to form the NBA, basketball was nowhere near the powerhouse sport it is now. There were no big TV deals, no endorsement contracts, and no private jets or luxury lifestyles. Players weren't making generational money. In fact, most of them had second jobs just to survive. But now, how much did these players make? If you think rookie contracts today are rough, you might want to sit down for this one. The average NBA salary in 1946 was around $5,000 per year. Adjusted for today's inflation, that's about $75,000. Not bad, but definitely not buying a yacht money. And the league's total salary cap was $55,000 split across 11 teams. And just as stated, that's basically $5,000 per squad. Some players made as little as $4,000 a year, meaning they were earning less than a solid office job today. But while most players were barely making ends meet, a few stars actually cashed in by 1940s standards. Joe Fulks, then playing for the Philadelphia Warriors, led the league in scoring and pulled in a lucrative $8,000 salary. Tom King with the Detroit Falcons technically had the highest paycheck, $16,500. But here's the twist. He wasn't just a player. His salary included his roles as the team's business manager and PR director. And what about the first true megastar? That would be George Mikan. Mikan, the first dominant big man, signed a 5-year, $60,000 contract in 1946 with the Chicago American Gears before heading to the Minneapolis Lakers. That's around $1 million today. And that was extravagant at the time, but compared to today's Supermax deals, a bench player makes more in a week. But here's the thing. This wasn't normal. Mikan got that deal because the NBA and NBL were competing for top talent. And this same bidding war led to Bob Davies scoring a $50,000 4-year contract, which was unheard of at the time. But once the NBA officially formed in 1949, teams started locking down salaries and keeping players from chasing bigger paydays. How? With something they called the reserve clause. Imagine signing a contract, but even after it expires, your team still owns your rights. That's what NBA players had to deal with. The reserve clause made it nearly impossible for players to negotiate better salaries. Even after a contract ended, teams controlled the players' rights indefinitely. And players couldn't leave for a better deal unless their team traded or released them. Owners had all the power. Players had zero leverage. And this is why so many of them had off-season jobs just to survive. Some became insurance salesmen, others taught at schools, and a few even worked construction or bartending gigs. Because back then, basketball alone wasn't enough to pay the bills. The idea of an NBA player living like a rock star was laughable. And yet, within a few decades, everything would change. Because while the NBA started as a league of small salaries and even smaller negotiating power, the floodgates were about to open, and that reserve clause wouldn't last forever. The owners were still running the show, setting strict salary caps to prevent bidding wars. And if you didn't like it, too bad. You either played where they told you to play, or you were out of a job. But that wouldn't last forever because one man decided he had enough. If there was ever a guy who could shake things up, it was Bob Cousy. By the early 1950s, Cousy was already a Boston Celtics legend, but he wasn't just a flashy passer, he was a thinker. And in 1954, he looked around at the NBA and said, "Nah, this ain't it." Players were getting lowballed, fined for ridiculous things, and basically had no say in anything. So Cousy rallied his fellow hoopers and formed the NBA Players Association. And despite still being in its infancy, they had some major victories. They eliminated a $15 fine for talking on the bench, and they raised the meal allowance from $5 to $7 per day. $7. That wouldn't even cover a small meal today. But back then, it was a win. But while the NBPA was now a thing, players were still a long way from real money. But by the 1960s, basketball wasn't just some niche sport anymore. It was blowing up.
I certainly was aware that my style of playing was attractive to fans in those days, that it was a selling tool at a time when we were trying to do everything we could to attract people in. I probably got as many letters in those days as any player that came through during that period from high school coaches telling me how much harm I was doing to all the kids in the country who were basketball players because they were imitating all this crap.
And with the NBA gaining a national following, more fans meant more money. And more money meant players were starting to realize their worth. And for the first time ever, players actually had leverage. But that didn't mean owners were just going to hand over bigger checks. This was about to turn into a battle. And leading the charge were Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell. If you think players today are competitive about contracts, Wilt and Russell did it first, and arguably pettier than anyone since. Let's start with Wilt. By the time he entered the NBA in 1959, he was already a basketball anomaly. 7'1", unstoppable in the paint, and a true box office attraction. Fans paid just to see him dominate. So when the Philadelphia Warriors signed him for $30,000 a year, he immediately became the highest paid player in the league. But that wasn't the end of it, because Bill Russell wasn't about to let Wilt flex that paycheck uncontested.
What a block by Russell!
In 1965, he signed a new deal worth $100,000 per year. But Russell wasn't having it, so he marched straight into the Celtics front office and demanded a raise. Not just any raise, though. He wanted exactly $100,001, just to make sure he was getting $1 more than Wilt. And the Celtics gave it to him without hesitation. This was the first player-driven contract war in NBA history. But more importantly, it proved that star players could dictate salaries, not just the owners. But while Wilt and Russell's contract battles were great for top stars, the rest of the league was still struggling. NBA owners still controlled everything, and players were basically disposable assets. But in 1964, the players had finally had enough.
That moment, the owners really, they caved. When someone as powerful as a network says, we're not going to show this product, they capitulated, there's no question.
The 1964 NBA All-Star Game was supposed to be historic. It was going to be the first ever nationally televised NBA game. The league was struggling financially, so this was their big chance to finally break through to a national audience. But the players saw leverage, and they used it.
We knew how important the television contract was going to be to all the owners. They wanted that game televised, and we knew that. This was our opportunity.
The All-Star games were the only time that the Players Association met.
Boston Celtics legend Tommy Heinsohn, a key NBPA leader, led a wildcat strike. Right before tip-off, the players refused to take the court because NBA owners had ignored every demand the NBPA had sent during the offseason. With millions of TV viewers waiting and networks ready to broadcast, the owners panicked and they caved. And the NBPA was officially recognized. And they immediately started making real changes. The NBPA pushed for higher salaries for all players, and by 1967, the players secured minimum salaries for the first time ever. $10,000 for rookies, about $100,000 today, and $12,500 to $13,500 for veterans. That's about $125,000 plus today. But this was still nowhere near what today's players make. But at the time, it was a breakthrough. But the biggest fight was still ahead, because the 1970s were coming, and the fight for free agency was about to shake the league to its core. For decades, players had no real freedom. They were locked into teams indefinitely, earning far less than their actual value. But then, in 1970, one man stepped up and said, "Enough is enough."
I played in every All-Star game during my career. I speak here today on behalf of the players in the National Basketball Association.
You seem to have done pretty well. Do you think you're worth more than the $100,000 you're getting?
To be honest with Frank, I think so.
In 1970, Oscar Robertson and the NBPA filed a groundbreaking lawsuit that directly challenged the NBA's most restrictive policies. The lawsuit dragged on for 6 years, creating tension between players and owners. But in 1976, the battle ended with a historic collective bargaining agreement, and true free agency was born. For the first time ever, players could negotiate with any team once their contracts expired. But there was a catch. Teams still received compensation when losing a player, so it wasn't the completely unrestricted free agency we see today. Still, it was a massive win for players. And just in time, because another major disruptor was about to shake up NBA salaries even more. In 1967, the NBA got a serious problem, a new rival league called the ABA. And unlike the NBA, the ABA had one major advantage: money. They weren't afraid to spend big and steal top talent from the NBA. They aggressively recruited NBA stars, offering massive contracts. Dr. J, Rick Barry, and George Gervin all signed with the ABA because it simply paid better.
The proposal that Oakland has offered to me is something that I feel is best for my wife and my family as far as our security is concerned, and this is the reason why I've decided to go over. And it was the most difficult decision I've ever had to make in my life, because Frank and Muley and everybody with the Warriors has just been tremendous to me, and it was extremely difficult, and this is really an understatement when I say that. It was very difficult for me to make this final decision. I think that the American Basketball Association definitely has the financial backing that is needed for a basketball team to survive, or a basketball league to survive. I think that the old league that was established a few years back did not have the financial security that these people do have. And of course, you have to go into this thing realistically, realizing that of course you're not going to go in and become a big money maker, and this is the way that these people feel. And I think with this type of an attitude, they can't help but be a success, especially if they can get some of the younger ball players just coming into the picture.
And this forced NBA teams to increase salaries to stop their best players from leaving. And that led to one of the most important moments in NBA contract history. By the early 1970s, salaries were already climbing, but in 1971, Spencer Haywood became the first player to sign a $1.5 million contract. At the time, this was absolutely unheard of. No player ever made that kind of money, and suddenly the floodgates were open. The NBA had no choice but to start paying big to keep its stars. And no one benefited more than Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. If you were looking for the most successful player of the decade, both in performance and paycheck, it was Kareem. During the 1970-71 season, Kareem was already making $250,000 per year with the Milwaukee Bucks. By 1975, he signed a 5-year, $2.5 million deal. That's about $14.5 million today. Then, in 1976, Dr. J signed a 5-year, $6 million contract with the 76ers, about $35 million today. But the biggest payday of them all? That was coming in the 1980s.
And that sends everyone reeling. Julius Erving.
By the time the 1980s rolled around, NBA salaries were skyrocketing. The league was growing, TV deals were expanding, and big market teams like the Lakers and Knicks were flexing their financial muscle, throwing money around like it was monopoly cash. But smaller teams were struggling to keep up. This led to huge financial gaps between franchises, and the league knew it had to step in. So they introduced the salary cap, a rule designed to put a limit on team spending while making sure players still got a fair slice of the revenue. Here's what the new deal included. Players were guaranteed 53 to 57% of the NBA's total revenue, $500,000 in licensing fees, and a guaranteed 253 jobs across the league, protecting roster spots. And this was huge. For the first time ever, players were tied directly to league profits, meaning the better the NBA did, the more players would get paid. But there was one massive loophole. While the salary cap was supposed to keep spending in check, teams quickly found a way around it. And that's where Larry Bird comes in. Bird had just transformed the Boston Celtics into a powerhouse, and when his contract was up, Boston wanted to keep him no matter the cost. So the NBA introduced Bird rights, a special rule that allowed teams to re-sign their own players without it fully counting against the salary cap. This was basically a cheat code for keeping superstars. Teams could pay their best players any amount to keep them, while still following cap rules for everyone else, and the salaries kept climbing. By the late 1980s, NBA revenue was through the roof, and in 1988, the new collective bargaining agreement locked in the 53% revenue split for players. Before the 1980s, no NBA player had ever cracked $1 million per season, but that all changed with Moses Malone. He became the first player to make $1 million per year when he signed a 3-year, $3 million contract with the Houston Rockets. And in 1982, he took it even further, signing a 6-year, $13.2 million deal with the Philadelphia 76ers, making him the first $2 million per year player. In 1981, Magic Johnson signed a 25-year, $25 million deal with the Lakers, the longest contract in NBA history. Of course, by today's standards, $1 million per year isn't much, but back then, it was game-changing. And with every new superstar deal, the NBA's financial game kept evolving. If the 1980s was the decade that introduced big money, the 1990s was when NBA salaries went completely off the rails. With TV deals booming, global expansion in full swing, and Jordan turning the NBA into a worldwide phenomenon, contracts skyrocketed to levels never seen before.
It became personal with me.
At the start of the 1990s, the NBA's highest paid player wasn't Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, or Larry Bird. It was Patrick Ewing, pulling in $4.25 million for the 1990-91 season while anchoring the New York Knicks. Meanwhile, the median NBA salary was $650,000, meaning most players were still making solid but not generational money. But that changed fast. In 1991-92, Larry Bird became the first player in NBA history to earn over $5 million in a single season with a salary of $7.07 million. For context, 5 years earlier, the highest paid player was barely making $2 million. But now, players were shattering salary records every season. Even the median salary jumped. Players like Charles Jones, Nick Anderson, and Olden Polynice were pulling in $750,000 per year. And even though the highest paid player dipped slightly in 1992-93, David Robinson at $5.72 million, NBA salaries weren't slowing down. By 1993-94, the median salary hit $1.1 million, meaning even bench players were making more than some all-time greats from previous decades. But the real financial explosion was still to come, because by the mid-90s, NBA salaries were about to go from huge to completely absurd. Even though Magic Johnson had retired in 1991 due to his HIV diagnosis, the Lakers honored the deal they had signed in 1992, a contract that would pay him $14.66 million in 1994-95, making him the first NBA player to earn over $10 million in a single season. At the time, this wasn't just the biggest contract in NBA history. It was the largest single-season payout in the history of team sports. To put it in perspective, the median NBA salary at the time was just $1.1 million, and Magic was making more than 13 times that, while not even playing. This set a new precedent. If Magic can get $14 million, how much would superstars in their prime start demanding? The answer? $100 million. By the mid-90s, NBA teams were throwing money around like there was no tomorrow.
For Pippen. Oh, a faithful Scottie Pippen in the face of Patrick Ewing.
And in 1996, the Washington Bullets offered Juwan Howard a 7-year, $89 million deal. But then the Miami Heat swooped in and outbid them, offering Howard a 7-year, $100 million contract. For a brief moment, Howard became the first player in NBA history to sign a 9-figure deal. But then, the NBA voided the contract because Miami miscalculated their salary cap space, and after a nasty legal battle, they lost the deal.
Juwan, what about the contract? Juwan?
Knowing they had to make it right, Washington upped their offer to $105 million, officially making Howard the first player to ever sign a $100 million plus contract. And just like that, the $100 million contract club was born. But Howard wasn't the only one cashing in. The same year, Alonzo Mourning signed a $105 million deal, but just 1 year later, Kevin Garnett surpassed them both. In 1997, the Minnesota Timberwolves handed a 21-year-old Garnett a 6-year, $126 million contract, the largest in NBA history at the time. NBA owners were panicking, realizing that mega contracts were about to spiral out of control, and they weren't wrong. By the end of the decade, $100 million contracts were the new norm. Rasheed Wallace signed an $80 million contract over 6 years, Shaq, $120 million over 7 years, and Chris Webber, $127 million over 7 years. But with teams spending like crazy, the NBA had a serious problem. Players were securing massive contracts, and the owners were struggling to keep up with skyrocketing salaries.
Now, the latest on the NBA lockout is pretty well what everybody expected, which is not good.
I won't say it was a heated exchange. It was a very good exchange. There were a lot of incisive and direct questions asked by our players.
That on using our existing format, we would be down to 68 games. As we compute that, apart from the substantial losses that the owners are taking now,
I would say that there does seem to be more of a sense of urgency towards getting one done.
So the NBA locked out its players for 232 days, the longest work stoppage in league history at the time. And a new collective bargaining agreement was introduced. Maximum salaries were based on years played and thus ending unlimited bidding wars. Rookie contracts were locked into 3-year deals, optional 4th and 5th years, and revenue split adjustments to keep contracts sustainable. Basically, the NBA wanted parity, while players still wanted paydays. The compromise? Superstars still got paid, but teams now had limits. And as the 1990s turned into the 2000s, the salary game wasn't slowing down. And if anything, it was about to get even crazier, because the next generation of NBA stars were about to redefine NBA contracts all over again. And this brings us to the modern era. Before we dive into the era of Supermax contracts and record-breaking deals, let's break down what actually drives NBA salaries. The simple answer? League revenue. Through the collective bargaining agreement, NBA salaries are directly tied to how much money teams are bringing in. Here's how it works. Players are entitled to 51% of BRI. The salary cap rises as the NBA makes more money. And when media rights deals increase, payroll jumps. The biggest chunk of this income is media rights deals. TV networks pay billions for the right to broadcast NBA games, and when these deals are renegotiated, the salary cap spikes. It all started in 2002 when the NBA left NBC's legendary Round Ball Rock era and partnered with ESPN, ABC, and Turner Sports for a media deal worth $750 million per year. At the time, it was a solid agreement, but the league was still finding its footing after the post-Michael Jordan transition. By 2007, the league saw only a slight bump in its TV contract to $900 million annually, reflecting a period when NBA interest had cooled slightly. Jordan was gone, ratings weren't quite the same, and while stars like LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, and Dwayne Wade were thrilling fans, the financial growth was steady, not explosive. But that all changed in 2014, when the NBA nearly tripled its media deal, locking in a $2.7 billion per year contract through the 2024-25 season. This was a turning point. The league had become a global powerhouse thanks to social media, international expansion, and the rise of super teams that turned regular season matchups into must-watch television. And just recently, the NBA has just shattered its previous records with its latest 11-year, $76 billion TV deal that kicked in the 2025-26 season. The new agreement, which includes Disney, NBC Universal, and Amazon, is game-changing. With streaming services entering the mix, it's not crazy to think that NBA payrolls could push past $1 billion per team in the near future. But media money isn't the only factor. Other key elements include the overall league interest. More fans means more revenue, global expansion, and economic trends. And with all this money flowing in, contracts have evolved into two major types of max deals. In simple terms, there are two types of max contracts in today's NBA: the rookie max extension and the Supermax contract. When a young star finishes their rookie contract, their team can offer an extra large extension if they hit certain benchmarks. If a player wins MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, or makes an All-NBA team in the past 2 seasons, they can sign a deal worth up to 30% of the salary cap. Great examples are Luka Doncic and Trae Young. Both earned All-NBA honors before their max extensions kicked in. This keeps young stars locked into their teams without hitting the 35% Supermax threshold. And this brings us to the Supermax contract. This is more officially called the Designated Veteran Player Exception. The Supermax contract was introduced in 2017 to help teams keep their biggest stars. To qualify, a player must be in their 8th or 9th NBA season. He must have won MVP, DPOY, or made an All-NBA team in the last season or 2 of the last 3, and must have been with their current team since the end of their rookie contract. Supermax deals allow teams to offer 35% of the salary cap, which leads to eye-watering contract numbers. And with all this in mind, let's dive into the modern contract boom. In 2000, the average NBA franchise was worth $207 million. By 2010, that number jumped to $369 million. And by 2020, it was $2.1 billion. And teams like the Warriors, Lakers, and Knicks are valued at over $7 billion. Billionaire owners are celebrated for their business acumen, flipping franchises for insane profits, while players, the ones actually driving the league's revenue, are sometimes ridiculed for their massive contracts. But make no mistake, this money isn't random. The NBA is booming and players are finally getting their cut. Kobe Bryant was already one of the highest paid players in the 2000s, but in 2013, he made history. He became the first player in NBA history to earn $30 million in a single season. His $30.45 million salary in 2013-14 set a new benchmark for NBA contracts. And at the time, Kobe's contract was seen as outrageous, but within a few years, it would seem small compared to what was coming next. Because in the 2010s, NBA contracts started breaking the $100 million and $200 million barriers like never before. LeBron James didn't just change the game on the court, he completely redefined player empowerment in contract negotiations. In 2010, LeBron took full control of his career by signing short-term contracts with the Miami Heat instead of locking himself into a long-term deal. And this was because he wanted flexibility to renegotiate as the salary cap kept increasing, maximizing his earnings and never getting stuck in a bad situation. This strategy became the blueprint for modern superstars. By 2018, when he signed with the Lakers, he locked in a 4-year, $154 million contract, one of the richest deals in history at the time. And just as LeBron was redefining player control, Steph Curry was rewriting the financial ceiling. By 2017, the NBA's revenue explosion had led to another contract milestone. Steph Curry signed a 5-year, $201 million contract with the Golden State Warriors. He became the first player in NBA history to sign a $200 million plus deal. I mean, his contract was worth more than entire NBA franchises in the 80s. And if this wasn't enough, just 4 years later, in 2021, he became the first player to sign two $200 million contracts, inking a 4-year, $215 million extension with Golden State. At this point, 9-figure contracts were becoming the new normal. Russell Westbrook signed a 5-year, $205 million contract. James Harden, a 4-year, $228 million. And Giannis Antetokounmpo, 5-year, $228 million deal. And then the NBA decided to break the bank, introducing the Supermax contract. At first, it seemed like a financial flex reserved for league-altering superstars, but then came Jaylen Brown in 2023. And that's when things got chaotic. When news of his 5-year, $304 million deal hit social media, fans collectively lost their minds. $60 million per year for a guy who isn't even the best player on his own team? But just as we were wrapping our heads around the reality, the Celtics ran it back with an even bigger bag. Because then, Jason Tatum happened. Not even a full year later, Boston handed Tatum an eye-watering 5-year, $314 million extension, officially making him the highest-paid player in NBA history. By the time this deal reaches its final season, Tatum will be making $71.4 million per year. For perspective, he'll be making more in one game than Michael Jordan did in his entire 1997-98 season. His final salary alone will be bigger than some entire NBA teams' payrolls from the early 2000s. And this is just the beginning, because every time a new TV deal drops, the NBA prints even more money. And as long as that keeps happening, these contracts are only going to get bigger. We're officially entering the era where NBA players will be making 9 figures per season, not on endorsements, not on business ventures, but just for dribbling a basketball. At this point, it's not a matter of if the NBA will hand out a $500 million contract, it's just a matter of who gets there first. With every cap increase, these deals keep ballooning, and by 2029, a Supermax contract is projected to hit $489 million over 5 years. That's nearly $500 million just to put a ball through a hoop. The real question, who's going to be the first to break the bank? And the NBA's next wave of superstars is already staking their claims. Paulo Banchero is turning into the kind of do-it-all forward teams build dynasties around. Chet Holmgren is a two-way unicorn with the kind of defensive instincts that make coaches lose sleep. But if anyone's getting the NBA's first $500 million contract, it's probably Victor Wembanyama. Think about it. He's a basketball anomaly, a 7'4" alien with guard skills, elite shot blocking, and a smooth jumper. That's not something you find twice in a generation. The hype around Wemby was so ridiculous that teams spent an entire season tanking just for a shot at drafting him. And it's not just about his skill. He's a marketing goldmine. He's already the face of French basketball before turning 21, with the NBA expanding internationally, and he's the perfect global superstar, and he sells out arenas just by showing up. If he keeps progressing the way everyone expects, the Spurs won't just offer him the first $500 million deal, they might not even blink while doing it. And if media rights keeps inflating salaries the way they have for the past 2 decades, the numbers after that might not even start with a 5. But here's where things get really interesting. The NBA's new collective bargaining agreement will shake up the way teams spend money, and it could completely change who gets paid and how much. The league has put harsh new penalties in place for teams that go deep into luxury tax territory, making front offices think twice before handing out those mega deals. The superstars will still be getting paid ridiculous money. The NBA isn't about to stop rewarding its franchise players, but teams will have to be much more selective about who they commit to long term. Not every borderline all-star is getting a blank check anymore, and the biggest impact will be on role players who could feel the squeeze. In an effort to keep payrolls in check, teams might start prioritizing cap flexibility, cutting costs on their supporting cast and focusing on top-heavy rosters. That's going to create an even bigger gap between the league's elite and everyone else. So while the next wave of Supermax deals will break records, the number of players actually getting them could shrink. But make no mistake, the money isn't slowing down. From players hustling second jobs just to survive, to building empires bigger than some NBA franchises. From $7 steak dinners at roadside diners to $70 million contracts that could buy the entire restaurant chain. From George Mikan cashing a $12,000 check to Jason Tatum securing a deal so massive it could bankroll a small country. NBA contracts have evolved into a spectacle of their own, a never-ending arms race of zeros and commas. And here's the wildest part. We're only halfway through the movie, because as long as the NBA keeps printing billions, these contracts, they'll just keep getting bigger, crazier, and even more unbelievable. So the next time you see a Supermax drop and the internet goes into full meltdown mode, just remember, we haven't seen anything yet.